The next step in the process is when the nominee appears in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The size and membership of the Senate Judiciary Committee changes, but the current membership is 11 Republicans and 10 Democrats. The current leadership of the committee is comprised of the chairman, Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, and the ranking minority member, Senator Dianne Feinstein from right here in California. So what happens in the Judiciary Committee? Well, just like everybody else, the members of the Judiciary Committee gather lots of information, as much information as they can, on the nominee's background to prepare for what's coming next. Individual meetings are held with the nominee. The nominee travels to Capitol Hill, meets privately with each member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and often with other members of the Senate as well. But the main thing that the Senate Judiciary Committee does is it holds hearings where it invites the witness or the nominee to come and testify along with other individuals as well. Hearings on Supreme Court nominees are actually a relatively new phenomenon. They were extremely rare until the 20th century. And even when they were conducted, generally the nominee didn't come to Washington and appear in front of the committee. That changed in 1925 when Justice Harlan Stone became the first to appear because there were certain allegations of impropriety that he wanted to rebut. And he was successful because he was appointed to the court. In 1937, the Senate began to require hearings for the first time. So since 1937, there have been hearings for every nominee. And it was in 1949 that the Senate started inviting nominees to testify. And all nominees since 1949 have indeed done that. The length of these hearings have extended. Originally, they lasted a day. Now, typically, although it can be different, they will last 4 days. The format of the hearing is usually consistent. First, they begin with opening statements by committee members. Now, this takes up much of the first day. There are 21 members of the committee. And so the opening statements usually run 15 or 20 minutes, and so that tends to take up several hours. Then some other senators typically will testify in front of the committee. These are often senators who may know the nominee personally or have worked with them professionally, but they will have kind words to say about the nominee before the nominee actually takes a seat. And then finally, the nominee has an opportunity to make an opening statement. This is extremely important because this is often the first time that most of the American public and the Senate has an opportunity to hear directly from the person that to this point has probably been unknown. The opening statement is extremely important. Its importance is difficult to overstate because this gives the nominee an opportunity to frame the debate. Often there may be controversy swirling about a nominee, and this gives them an opportunity to put their own spin on it. And it is a classic lawyer's trick that if there's a controversy or something that you know is going to arise, an opening statement is a great opportunity to preemptively address that. So before your enemies have an opportunity to attack you and to ask you about this, then you have an opportunity to have a mea culpa and admit to any wrongdoing, or at least frame it in a way that will hopefully negate any attacks that may come later. We've got a couple of classic examples. One lesser-known example occurred when Stephen Breyer was nominated to the Supreme Court. Breyer was nominated by Bill Clinton, and he is a liberal, but he was actually opposed to a certain extent by liberals who thought he was too friendly to business. And in particular, they were concerned that he had ruled on cases that they believed he had a financial interest in, and that he should have recused himself from those cases. When Breyer came to the United States Senate, he was aware that this controversy was swirling, and he took an opportunity in his opening statement to address it, to frame it the way he wanted to, and he was very successful in that his nomination obviously succeeded, and the critics had a lot of the wind taken out of their sails. So let's take a quick look at Stephen Breyer's opening statement.
I want to add this, if I may. And that is, recently I know that, and this is important to me, that in recent weeks there have been questions raised about the ethical standard that I applied in sitting on certain environmental cases in the First Circuit at a time when I had an investment, an insurance investment, in Lloyd's. I recognize that this question has been raised by people of good faith, and there is nothing more important to me than my integrity and my reputation for impartiality. It is obviously a most important thing to preserve total public confidence in the integrity of the judicial branch of government. I have reviewed those cases again and the judicial recusal statute, and I personally am confident that my sitting in those cases did not present any conflict of interest. Of course, my investment was disclosed to the public. There has been absolutely no suggestion that Lloyd's was involved as a named party in any of the cases on which I sat. I know of no such involvement. The judicial recusal statute does require recusal as well if you have one case that has some kind of direct and predictable financial impact on some investment. That is to say, if it's not a speculative or remote or contingent impact. The cases on which I sat did not violate this standard either. That issue has been carefully looked into by independent ethics experts who share my view. But, Mr. Chairman, as I said, I recognize the importance of avoiding conflicts of interest or even the appearance of such conflicts. And that standard is essential for all judges, and especially essential for judges of the nation's highest court. So I certainly promise I will do all I can to meet it, including what I shall immediately do is ask the people who handle my investments to divest any holdings in insurance companies as soon as possible. And with respect to Lloyd's itself, I resigned in 1988, though because of one syndicate that remains open, I have been advised that I can leave altogether by the end of 1995, but I intend to ask the people involved to expedite my complete termination of any Lloyd's relationship. I'll be out of that as soon as I possibly can be. And finally, as I go forward, I certainly will keep in mind the discussion that has arisen over the last few days, and I will take it into account in reviewing any possible conflict whatsoever.
But the most famous example of a nominee using his opening statement to rebut criticism is Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas was nominated by George H.W. Bush to fill the vacancy created when Thurgood Marshall retired in 1991. Clarence Thomas was, like Thurgood Marshall, an African American, but unlike Thurgood Marshall, he was extremely conservative, which is one of the main reasons why Bush appointed him. Clarence Thomas went through the usual round of hearings, as we have just described, where he was asked questions about his legal philosophy, and everything was on track for his confirmation. But then, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who was at that time Joe Biden, learned of certain allegations of sexual harassment against Clarence Thomas were floating out there, and he issued the threat of a subpoena to have one individual come and testify in front of the committee, and therefore, very unusual at the time, a second round of hearings were held, but this round was not about Justice Thomas's legal philosophy, but rather whether or not he had sexually harassed Anita Hill. Anita Hill was a woman who had worked for him when he was the chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And many people noted that this was ironic because the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is the commission responsible for enforcing the nation's sexual harassment and civil rights laws. She testified that he would often make very lewd remarks, would refer to pornography that he had watched, that he had asked her out on dates, and had engaged in other inappropriate conduct. So this was a very lurid affair. And Justice Thomas was given an opportunity to come back and testify, and he was given an opportunity to make a second opening statement. And obviously he knew the allegations that were swirling about and that were going to be made about him. And in one of the most brilliant opening statements of all time, he was able to diffuse that criticism, to blunt that criticism and to blunt the charges. And of course he successfully went on to become a justice. And so what we're going to watch here is Clarence Thomas's second opening statement, where he deftly addresses these allegations.
Do you have anything you'd like to say?
Senator, I would like to start by saying unequivocally, uncategorically, that I deny each and every single allegation against me today that suggested in any way that I had conversations of a sexual nature or about pornographic material with Anita Hill, that I ever attempted to date her, that I ever had any personal sexual interest in her, or that I in any way ever harassed her. And from my standpoint, as a black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves, to do for themselves, to have different ideas. And it is a message that unless you kowtow to an old order, this is what will happen to you. You will be lynched, destroyed, caricatured by a committee of the U.S. Senate rather than hung from a tree.
Whether fair or not, Justice Thomas's use of the imagery of lynching was effective in blunting the charges. After the nominee has a chance to make their opening statement, then the main event begins, and that is when the committee has an opportunity to ask questions of the nominee. These nominees are generally extremely well coached. They will usually spend many hours before they appear before the Senate committee in a room with others who will put them through a mock hearing where they will be asked all of the questions that they anticipate being asked when they will actually appear, and they practice their answers, or more specifically, they practice their non-answers. The amount of time that's available for questioning is always determined in advance between negotiations between the majority and minority parties, although typically each senator has had 20 minutes per round in recent years. So each senator has about 20 minutes to ask questions of the nominee. However, multiple rounds are permitted, so once they go through all the senators, if other senators have additional questions, they can get another 20 minutes typically. And the parties alternate their asking of the questions in order of seniority. So they start with the chair of the committee, who has 20 minutes. They then go to the ranking minority member, who has 20 minutes, and then they go back and forth between the majority and minority party members. And this is often criticized as being unhelpful because it means that the questioning is broken up, in that members of the nominee's political party tend to ask friendly questions. Members of the nominee's opposite political party tend to ask hostile questions, but the 20-minute limit and the alternating going back and forth between the political parties means that there's really never much of an opportunity to build a sustained argument or a sustained line of questioning. Now, one of the big criticisms of the process is that the purpose of these hearings is to learn more about their justices and their views on various issues, and yet justices almost never answer actual questions about specific issues or specific cases. And this is largely due to what happened with Robert Bork and his rejection Many people felt that he was rejected because he was too talkative and he gave too many specific answers. And so now justices will rarely answer specific questions, and oftentimes the senators get very, very frustrated because they play their cards so close to the vest. And of course the question becomes, should they? Right now, let's take a quick look at a clip from the Brett Kavanaugh hearing. It's during his opening statement where he explains why he is not going to answer any specific questions.
And so all the nominees currently sitting on the Supreme Court, all the justices, have made clear a couple things. First of all, they can't discuss cases or issues that might come before them. As Justice Ginsburg said, no hints, no forecasts, no previews. That also means, with respect to at least the vast body of Supreme Court precedent going back, you can't give a thumbs up or thumbs down on the case. That's Justice Kagan's formulation. She said repeatedly, no thumbs up or thumbs down when she was asked, what do you think about this case? What do you think about that case? I liked her formulation there, no thumbs up or thumbs down. That nominee precedent, as I call it, is now, in my view, part of the independence of the judiciary. And that nominee precedent is something I need to adhere to when I am here as a nominee now, because that's one of my jobs here is not to advance my own interest, but remember I'm a representative of the judiciary as a whole, and I have a responsibility to judicial independence right here, right now as a nominee. So following that nominee precedent is going to be critical.
The unwillingness of most judicial nominees to answer any questions about their particular views has certainly led to various criticisms of the process as it's currently done. And the main criticism is that they're totally pointless, that these hearings do not change any minds, that no real information is generated. In fact, the Clarence Thomas hearings, the sexual harassment allegations, did not persuade anybody. Not one single senator changed their position, and that was undoubtedly true with the Brett Kavanaugh hearings as well. Not only is it pointless, but it can often devolve into an embarrassing spectacle, embarrassing both for the nominee and for the United States Senate. And this may discourage worthy candidates from being considered. Certainly the Clarence Thomas hearings were embarrassing, and the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, of course, led to cringeworthy moments like these.
Did you consume alcohol during your high school years?
Yes, we drank beer. My friends and I, the boys and girls, yes, we drank beer. I liked beer, still like beer. We drank beer. The drinking age, as I noted, was 18, so the seniors were legal. Senior year in high school, people were legal to drink. And we drank beer. And I said sometimes probably had too many beers, and sometimes other people had too many beers. We drank beer. We liked beer.
Because so little information is gathered, and because it does so often turn into a circus, the process is seen by many as lacking any kind of legitimacy, which is the whole point in the first place. And so some people say that we ought to reform the process, do things like perhaps hold them behind closed doors, and then perhaps you won't see as much political posturing. Or some say that we should simply end the hearings altogether because they are simply a sham. And that's certainly a question I'll ask you to weigh in on your paper assignment. Well, once the committee has had an opportunity to ask questions, and that's a process that can last for a couple of days, they have a few options. Their first option is to report the nomination favorably. What that means is simply that a majority of the committee votes in favor of the nomination. Stephen Breyer was unanimous, for example. They also have the option of reporting the nomination unfavorably. Now, normally, if a bill fails in committee, it does not move on to the full Senate. But with regard to Supreme Court justices, typically, even if a nomination fails in the Senate Judiciary Committee, it will still go on for an entire Senate vote. For example, Robert Bork failed in the Senate Judiciary Committee on a 5-9 vote, but his nomination was still sent on to the Senate, and they, of course, rejected him as well. The committee can also report the nomination with no recommendation. This, of course, occurs when there is a tie vote, And that happened with regard to Clarence Thomas, where the vote was a tie 7-7, which was indicative of the very, very close confirmation vote that ultimately was 52-48. And it's possible for them to simply not report the nomination at all. This is something that's relatively common with lower federal courts, but it's very uncommon with regard to the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, that's what's going on with the Senate Judiciary Committee. In our next lecture, we're going to find out what occurs in the full Senate.